Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and today I'm talking to Sue Oriel, who has a beautiful English country garden surrounded by fields, and she grows flowers in it for cutting and drying, and she sells to local florists under the name Country Lane Flowers. Sue's garden is really quite large, it's an acre, but she uses only about 1/10 of it for growing flowers for cutting, so this is something that should transfer very well to much smaller gardens. And I think we're all getting much more interested in how our flowers are grown and delivered to us. Just as we grow vegetables in our gardens because we want seasonal fresh vegetables that haven't been treated with chemicals or flown all over the world, so we're starting to think about that with flowers, seasonal local flowers which haven't used up petrol or diesel or airline fuel to get to our homes. But first, let's follow Sue and her little dog Bomber around the highlights of her garden, and then we'll get on to her tips for growing cut flowers in your garden and some really super simple ways of drying flowers that don't involve any special equipment or any chemicals. So, Sue, tell me how you organise your garden to grow flowers for cutting.
It's quite an organic sort of thing because I've got quite a large space, and what I don't want to do is to suddenly fence off a little bit of it. So some of the things I'm growing to cut and dry are in the regular part of the garden, the bit we're sitting in now, for instance, but other bits are being absolutely dedicated only to flowers for cropping, because it's a completely different attitude you have to take towards the flowers, whether you're just having a beautiful garden or whether you're then starting to harvest them. So you have to think farmer, not gardener. And it's quite difficult to begin with because you think, well, that doesn't look very pretty. That'll be yellow next to pink. That'll be horrible. And that's really an irrelevant consideration when you're growing for selling. So what I've done is I've taken the veg patch area, which was 4 2-metre square beds, and I have now decided that I'll simply buy my vegetables from local shops and I'll use those for flower growing. And I've got 2 other areas. One is also divided into a slightly raised bed, just with a margin around it, so that I can put some netting to protect it or some wire in order to support all the plants. You can't go around and individually stake the plants. It's far too laborious. So you then use something like a pig wire and you thread it over a really simple frame of wood you can buy from any joinery for, a tenner or something. And then the flowers grow up through it. So you don't have to think about individual staking, which of course in a garden, you'd never do that. So it's a different attitude. It's a question of maximising the space within the area you've dedicated. So thinking, well, this will grow tall and I'll harvest this around about May. This will just be getting going and I'll be harvesting that more in sort of July or August. And then remembering that you have to rip out the things you've harvested. You can't be sentimental about them. You go, right, that's done its thing, on to the next thing. And that's the other thing that I'm finding quite tricky to get to terms with. Because obviously most of me is a gardener still, a little bit of me is the flower farmer, and I'm getting more in that direction. If you think about it, there are essentially, you've got sort of 4 categories. You've got bulbs, you've got annuals, perennials and biennials. And if you do a sort of grid, you say, right, well, bulbs are largely spring and occasionally through the back end of the summer, but not a huge amount. Biennials again are spring, annuals are again from early to late summer, and then your perennials that flower whenever they flower. So if you produce a sort of grid, so you know that you've always got something going at a particular time of year, that's how you would plot it out. So at the moment I'm sowing biennials because I know that I've got to get them in the ground
ready to be flowering when they flower next year. So, and you would pick the sort of things that you know are popular as a sort of basis of what you're going for, with a few super special different things in the mix as well, because people like unusual, don't they?
The other thing, of course, to think about is the drying process. And I hope we'll look at some arrangements later, which I can show you that if you leave everything to dry in situ, they just go brown. You've got to learn to pick them when they've got colour in them and then treat them correctly. None of this nonsense with glycerin and all of that kind of stuff. It's all about when you pick it, how you hang it up, and whether you want the shape to be poker straight, which is what happens if you hang a flower up and it goes down, or whether you want a bit of a curve on it. If you leave it in a bucket, for instance, it'll develop a shape on it, which makes it a much more modern feel to a dried flower than those straight things that our parents used to have in their spare bedrooms.
So when do you actually pick the flowers for drying?
It all depends on when the flower itself goes over. So for instance, take an allium like a spherocephalum. That's a little round acorn head allium. You need to pick those when they're in full flower, because otherwise they're just brown blobs if you leave them to go too long. On the other hand, a great big allium like a sensation or something like that, the purpleness of it will fade in 5 seconds flat, and you'll end up with just a great big blobby thing. So you really want it to go to seed and then turn itself into a big Sputnik-y thing that looks absolutely fabulous. So that it's all a question of judging it by the individual flower that you're actually looking at.
And which flowers are best for growing for drying?
At the moment, I'm not growing anything specifically for drying, but I'm using the things that I've got to experiment as to how well they dry. And the answer is a lot of them dry extremely well. So take, for instance, something like a cotton lavender, which, I mean, is a very old-fashioned plant. It's got a sort of yellow kind of bud head on it. If you harvest that while it's yellow, it's still yellow 6 months later, looks fabulous. Or if you take a really vibrant, like a Hidcote lavender, that will be proper dark purple. It won't fade away like the Munsteds and some of the other ones. Some of the flowers that you put them in a bucket, you think, well, oh, that might dry out, and it's just a tragic, sad thing, and you think, well, no one's going to like that. A lot of wildflowers dry very well. I've got a lot of wild carrot that I've harvested, and it looks fantastic. Also, a lot of the sedge grasses are very beautiful, the black colour. A lot of the pennisetum have beautiful floppy long tails that you want to get to grow into things. Larkspur dries beautifully. The petals dry the colour of the flower on a larkspur. So, and that's also now used for confetti as a sort of ecologically positive alternative to paper or rice, as I know vicars are not keen on these things in their churchyards. So I've got a lot of larkspur drying. Things like hydrangea heads, dried standing upright. If you turn them over, they go terrible. The shape goes and everything. It's which plant works for drying in which particular way, and it's experimentation as much as it is, because I can't find any books on how to dry flowers. You've got to make it up as you go along a bit.
So there are two ways of doing it. One, you turn it upside down and
Yes.
hang it from the ceiling.
Correct.
And then the other way is put it in a bucket and just leave it without water.
Correct. It's remembering that once it's dry, it's dry. You can't shape it up again. If you've decided you don't like your grasses this shape, well, tough, you've done it now. You're not going to be able to do anything with that. So it is about thinking in advance how you want to use them in your arrangements too, and making sure that that they're not all poker straight, because nobody would appreciate a bunch of flowers where everything was poker straight upwards. And exactly the same with dried flowers. So if you cut them earlier, before they've gone brown, they retain green as well, which I'll also show you when we look at some of the arrangements I've done for you.
You're growing some cutting flowers for your niece's wedding next year.
I am, yes.
So tell me which flowers you've decided to choose.
Well, she's chosen a lot of them because in fact, a year from now she'll be 2 days married, so it's a September wedding, and obviously the palette of colours is becoming limited. It's not totally limited, becoming limited, but she's always been a big fan of her auntie's dahlias. So she's chosen a lot of those, and this year we've planted up quite a few beds. And then I've said to her, I don't think this one works, the stem is too fine, or this one won't work because the colour doesn't work with the other things. So she came here a few weeks ago and we had a bit of a cull of the things we weren't going to do. But a dahlia won't dry, I'll tell you that for nothing.
And are you going to make confetti? And how will you make that? Will you going to make the dried flower confetti?
I'm going to have a go. I tried with some rose petals, but they go very brown and not very interesting. I harvested the end of the larkspur about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and those are hanging up to dry in my neighbour's barn. And we've got an absolute ton of it. It's all pretty purpley colour. It's absolutely lovely. And as it dries, it's staying that way. I don't know how much confetti a person needs for a wedding, so...
How do you keep the dried flowers? Once you've got them, do you need to be careful where they're kept at all?
You can't put them in a very bright room because they fade. So you need to either pull the curtains or put them in your garage, or if you have an outbuilding of any sort, a shed would do. I haven't had any problems with mice or other animals so far. The one thing you do get is as things dry, their seeds will drop out. So I was hanging some new flowers in the garage recently, and I bumped into some poppies that had dried beautifully, and I spent the next 2 days picking poppy seeds out of my underwear, which was lovely. So a lot of them are either in jars that I've kept upright in my spare bedroom, or they're in the garage if they're very large. Things like honesty, I've got enormous forests of that. That's that lovely, papery, silvery colour thing when it's finally dried out, and I think that's just very attractive on its own anyway. So, yeah.
And how long does a dried flower last?
Well, I think I can't see any reason why they shouldn't last pretty much indefinitely, because as long as you don't bump into them, they're not having the wind blowing at them. They just sit there being them, and I don't think there's any reason to think that they wouldn't have quite a lengthy shelf life, really. In fact, some of the florists I know are very happy to buy things in bulk, because if they can't sell them that day, they can whip them up, turn them up, dry them, and keep them to sell for later on in the winter when there isn't anything else.
Can you dry leaves on plants?
Yes, you can, and some will dry better than others. I mean, I recently dried some bracken because in any normal arrangement, you're going to still want to take some of the similar principles of arranging flowers anyway. So you're going to need a support act to go with the stars. You do need to learn how to dry some exactly the same thing, turn them upside down. Very fine leaves will crumple and will simply fall off. All the honesty leaves fall off, for instance. The bracken has not fallen off, and it looks really rather lovely. Again, I think it's just a trial and error. Something with a nice colour, maybe like a beech with a lovely dark red colour, they'd be lovely, because contrasts, this is your colour for drying flowers. It's not as though you can go red, yellow, purple. Not that you ever would, probably, but this is how you introduce a colour. So anything with something that isn't just a plain green is really helpful to lift an arrangement.
The garden, when I first bought the house, was just a field, and it was neglected for many, many years. It was essentially farming land with a scrubby hedge around the outside edge. What I thought was, I don't like a garden where you just walk in and see it straight off, no surprises. So what I did was to make a list of all the things I really, really wanted in a garden. So I wanted a cottage garden where I could just stick anything I wanted to grow. I wanted a vegetable garden where I could nurture things, propagate things, do vegetable seeds, those kind of things. I wanted an open area with some wild grass that didn't need too much attention, and most particularly I didn't want a lawn. I'm not a lawn sort of person. So those were the sort of basic thoughts that I had, and I involved a garden designer to help me visualize a lot of this. The other problem about this area is it's beautiful countryside all round. You don't want to block it all out, so you wanted to keep some sense of attachment to where you were. You didn't want to sort of just be landed in the middle of the space. So sight lines and exit points for views was, I thought, really, really important. The problem with this area is it's incredibly windy, so you do need a little bit of a hedge of some sort to just slow things down a bit. So that's sort of how we started, really. And then it was just lots of cups of tea and caramel wafers by Tunnocks. We ate a lot of those, and we planned the garden over the winter, and then made a start on it in the sort of round about February, March it out. I mean, I've only just started this, so I'm sure I'll make super hoops of mistakes and not get things right. Everyone tells me I need a polytunnel, but I just can't bear the idea. Not having a bigger greenhouse was always a mistake. I think, oh, I wish I'd got a smaller greenhouse, says no gardener ever. Actually, my favourite time of the morning is quite early. Get up with a dog, about 7:30. Make a massive cup of tea, I mean like a mug of a huge cup of tea, and then we go and sit in the corner of this field and we just survey it, because I'm looking out this way, and it's really interesting to sometimes go and sit with a different perspective and look in that way and go, oh, do you know, it doesn't look as bad as you think it does from this distance. Can't see any of the weeds.
There are links to Sue Oriel's Country Lane flowers in the description below, and also to any other resources that we've mentioned. And if you've enjoyed this, do please hit like, because then I'll know that you'd like to see more about what you can do in your garden, and maybe even starting a small business from it. And if you'd like more tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden, then do subscribe to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.